We'll start with the Kuzari. We're on page 289, the bottom of page 289. And we're moving on to, continuing in our discussion of the conduct of a saintly person and what the saintly person does in order to live their life with a sense of purpose and meaning. So we're on subparagraph 22, where the Kuzari writes, "The saintly person instills in his heart the conviction that all of God's acts are just, so that his beliefs act as a shield and refuge in relation to the affliction and tragedies that occur in the world." It's a very poetic way of saying it. It's really a beautiful way of saying it. What he's really suggesting is that we look out in the world and we see apparent injustice. And there's so many things that we could look at in this world and say that God's not fair, God is not just. And so a person who strives for piety constantly has to suppress those arguments and remind himself of the counter-arguments to the apparent injustice that exists in the world. And he says that those convictions, when we say Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo, that God is the rock and all of his acts are pure. There's a practice in Judaism called Tziduk Adin, which is to justify anything that happens in life and say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emes, God is the true judge. And I don't understand necessarily why this is happening, why tragedy sometimes strikes, but God is just. And that conviction acts as a shield and a refuge for those times in life which are stormy and things don't seem to be just. So the question is, how do you do that? That's easier said than done, correct? So he writes that one accomplishes this by pondering the way God treats all creatures justly and how he provides for them and guides them wisely. So it's a very, it's a novel way of approaching it. But he says, look out into nature and take a look at how every single living creature seems to be provided for miraculously. Although no one can comprehend the details, we can nevertheless appreciate the generalities of the system. We see how perfectly structured all creatures are, and we see the wondrous phenomena which reflect upon the intent of he who is wise, desirous, omniscient, and omnipotent. And so essentially what he's arguing is that if we look out into the natural order of the world, and we see a sense of order, and we see a sense of maintenance, of how every single creature is maintained by Hashem, then we come to the conclusion that Hashem knows what he's doing. And Hashem is not sort of just like throwing paint at a wall, at a canvas, and hoping that it splatters in the right direction. Nothing is happening randomly, because all of the laws of science run according to structure. Every single species is maintained according to a certain eco-balance. And we recall, especially in today's world, we see how delicate that balance in the ecosystem is. That if there's only 1 degree too high or 1 degree too low, or a pH balance is off, it could destroy, so many different things. Man is doing more to wreak havoc on the ecosystem than Hashem ever could have done. Hashem could have destroyed a lot of things over the course of time, and there have been periods in history where Hashem has brought an ice age, or other times when an imbalance in the ecosystem has been created. But overall, when we look at the system as it is today, it's a very steady, maintained system, and Hashem therefore seems to know what he is doing. And he continues, as we turn the page, God has provided for the needs of each creature, small and large alike, in the way of instincts, sensory perception, internal organs and limbs, and has in turn provided each with equipment that is appropriate to that creature's makeup. For example, Hashem gave hyenas a ferocious temperament and the means to maul and tear. He gave the rabbit and the doe means to run swiftly, along with a timid temperament. When one ponders the creation of these limbs, their benefits, and the relation to the nature of the animal, he will note the justice and wise order of the system. This will remove any doubts about God's justness. And so, of course, a person could say, well, it's evolution. It's not, there's no divine system here. It's all evolution.
You could say it's the survival of the fittest.
It's the survival of the fittest. Look at the species that are here are the ones that just were able to emerge, and the ones who couldn't survive just didn't end up surviving. That's part of the evolutionary theory. You could say that. You could make that argument, but that would suggest that there is no guidance to the system. We're not suggesting that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's arguments are absolute proofs, but they do provide us looking out into the world and noting how various different species survive this planet and thrive in this planet, not just survive, but thrive, gives us rise to the conclusion that there is some kind of manhig, there is some kind of divine maintenance that is taking place in the world today. It doesn't prove it, but there certainly seems to be a pointing in that direction, that there's some sense of purpose and structure to the universe. Again, it's not an absolute proof, because a person could always look at evolution, point to evolution and say, like, survival of the fittest. But you have to have a certain belief system in that also. You have to have faith that things could have evolved in the way that it is suggested that they evolve. And who, after all, created the rules of science that allow for evolution and survival of the fittest? That's also something that points to a creator who creates laws of physics and laws of biology. We'll take a couple of points, yes.
But isn't it also how interdependent we are? Everything is even like the bacteria in our stomach, the relation between us and a tree in terms of them giving off oxygen, us giving off carbon. I mean, it's all very detailed and very
it's extremely intricate and very everything's linked together. It's a good point.
Well, with all respect to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, I feel like these arguments completely pale in the face of one child in India who's begging and starving. This doesn't move me at all.
But the child who's begging in India, I would have used a different argument. I'm surprised that you used that argument. The child who's begging in India does not have God to blame for his starvation. Child is that he has mankind to blame, because there's more than enough food to go around.
Okay, but God is allowing it to happen and allowing him to suffer. Then you go to free will.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying the fact that
I would have used a different argument.
Okay.
I would have used the argument of a child stricken, God forbid, with cancer.
Okay, so use that argument.
Yeah.
And now, what do you say?
And the answer is that, like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says throughout the book, if you look at specific examples, you will be able to poke holes at my arguments. I'm asking you to look at the general system. The general system is an elegant system. There are many times that there are specific examples within a much larger system that don't seem to fit into the much larger pattern. Those are kashas. And we don't have to answer all of the kashas. You know why? Because even the Navi said, Yirmiyah says, I don't understand why certain righteous people suffer. I don't have an answer.
But he asked that question before you raised the question, and he's using this in nature.
That's what he's saying. And so basically he's saying that a person reflects upon the general system. And he notices the elegance, and he notices the balance, and he notices that there's a certain guidance to that system.
Okay, so all I'm saying is that if I look at nature, it doesn't...
Nature overall is non-chaotic. There are individual components within nature which seem to be chaotic. But that in itself cannot topple the overall system. That's his argument. Yes, please, go ahead.
Because I think you have to take into account you're looking into it with the limitation of your human mind.
Yeah.
So to begin with already, you cannot understand the whole thing. It's like a forest and a tree. We are a little tree. You cannot see in the vastness of the forest. The same with the laws of nature. So basically, I would have your argument just from that.
No, I agree with you, but you're saying suspend our judgment because we're so limited. I agree with that answer.
You're not suspending it. You bring it into perspective. You're understanding that from your understanding, you will not really understand.
I agree with you. I'm just saying that this idea that the rabbit has what he needs and the hyena has what she needs does nothing for me in terms of that. I don't know.
Okay. Again, Rabbi Yehuda Levi is saying, look at the forest. The forest functions elegantly. There may be individual trees which are diseased. And we'll always have questions on why that specific individual tree, why that specific individual child, Rahman al-Islam. There'll always be those questions. And those, I don't think he's proposing an answer for. I think, however, he says that when you look at the overarching system, you see a certain pattern and you see a certain wisdom. And that's how the pious person is able to instill himself with a sense of emunah. Because the questions arise when you focus in with a microscope on the details, on the individual components. And the exact point that he's making is, look at the overall system, and you'll notice that Hashem knows what he's doing on the macro level. When you shine a light on one individual component, it doesn't make sense. Okay, anyone else? All right. I wanted to share with you at this point the fact that what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is saying is not just his own theory, but it's really based in the Gemara. The Gemara in Maseches Bava Batra has a whole discussion about the book of Job, Sefer Iyov. And that's what I handed out today. We're going to just read it in English. But the book of Job is an entire discussion on theodicy, on why bad things apparently occur to good people, the apparent injustice in life. And the Gemara depicts that part of Job's challenge to God is, why is this happening? Is it possible, Hashem, that you make mistakes and that you don't have complete control over the system that you have created? That's essentially what Iyov is asking. But let's take a look at how the Gemara depicts it, and we'll see, I think, that this is really what Rabbi Yehuda Levi is basing himself on, that when you look at the overarching natural order of the world, you see that there's wisdom to it. Rabbah says, Job blasphemed with mention of a tempest, and he was answered with mention of a tempest.
What's a tempest?
Like a storm. Rabbah explains he blasphemed with mention of a tempest, bisa'ara in Hebrew. As it is written, he crushes me with a tempest. That's a pasuk from Sefer Iyov. Job said before God, Master of the universe, perhaps a tempest passed before you, and you confused Iyov, Job, with Oyev, enemy. Do you ever stand in the middle of a very, very windy storm, and you're trying to have a conversation with a friend, and the wind is blowing so powerfully that you can't hear what the other person is saying? So what Iyov, according to the way that the Gemara interprets this pasuk of God, you have crushed me with a tempest, he's saying like this: maybe Hashem, you heard the word Oyev, enemy, and you thought that because of the distortion of the winds, the word Iyov was being said instead of Oyev. Oyev is an enemy of God. Iyov is Job. So maybe that's the reason why you're coming down so hard on me, because you think I'm an enemy and I'm really just Iyov. So he was answered with mention of a tempest, as it is written. Then the Lord answered Job out of the tempest and said, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now your loins like a man, for I will demand of you, and let me know your answer. The all psukim from Iyov. What is the meaning of out of the tempest? So in other words, how do we interpret the psukim of what God's angry response to Iyov was? God said to him, I have created, and these are all references to psukim that are contained in the book of Iyov. I have created many hairs on a person, and for each hair I created its own follicle, through which the hair is sustained, so that two hairs should not draw from one follicle. Since were two hairs to draw from one follicle, they would impair a man's vision. I don't know that we necessarily subscribe to this science today, that if two hairs grow from one follicle, it impairs your vision. But let's grant it for just a moment anyway. Now, if I do not confuse one follicle with another, would I confuse Eov with Oyev? If I'm able to control that scientific system in the human body, okay, so he used the example of what was perhaps medieval understanding, that if two follicles grow from one hair, it makes you lose your sight, or makes you become nearsighted, right? So maybe that was the medieval belief, or the ancient world belief.
But it's Hashem saying that.
No, it's the Gemara saying this is what Hashem was saying to Eov. This is not in the pasuk itself. This is the rabbinic interpretation of what Hashem was saying to Eov. Yes? So the rabbis understood that what Hashem was essentially saying to Eov is that I control the very delicate balance within the human body. You could substitute another idea, right? In other words, let's say the opening and closing of the valves of the heart, let's say. And Hashem says, I control the very, very delicate balance within the opening and closing of the valves of the heart. Or I control the semi-permeable membranes in the lungs that allow oxygen to go into the bloodstream and through the alveoli. And if there was even just a slightly larger porous membrane, or the membrane pores were slightly too small, a person would either be suffocated or would die because of oxygen bubbles in the blood. You could come up with your own idea, but this is the idea, this is the example that is given.
In this example, they could have been talking about two eyelash follicles.
Maybe. That's interesting, isn't it? I don't know. So, but he says, if I do not confuse one follicle with another, would I confuse Eov with Oyev? The Hebrew word for tempest, sa'ara, is phonetically identical to the Hebrew word for hair. Okay. God further said to Eov, who has divided a channel for the torrent of rain, or a path for the lightning of thunder? This is a pasuk in Eov. And what the rabbis interpreted it to mean is, I have created many drops of water in the clouds, and for each drop I created its own channel, so that two drops should not emerge from the same channel. As were two drops to emerge from the same channel, they would destroy the earth and it would not yield produce. Again, I don't know what that means, but it's again a descriptive of some scientific phenomenon that was the belief in the times of the Gemara. Now, if I do not confuse one drop with another, would I confuse Eov with Oyev? Incidentally, the Gemara asks from where may it be inferred that this term ta'ala means a channel, and just skip to the next to the end of the paragraph. The second half of the aforementioned verse in Eov states, or a path for the lightning of thunder, which is interpreted as follows. God said, I have created many thunderclaps in the clouds, and for each and every thunderclap I created its own path, so that two thunderclaps should not issue forth from the same path. As were two thunderclaps to issue from the same path, they would destroy the world. Now, if I do not confuse one thunderclap with another, would I confuse Eov with Oyev? It is further stated there, do you know when the wild goats of the rock give birth? Can you mark when the hinds do calve? That's an explicit pasuk in Eov. So the Gemara explains, this goat is cruel to her young and shows them no pity. When she squats to give birth, she ascends to the top of a mountain so that the kid should fall down from her and die. And I summon her an eagle that receives it with his wings and places it before her. And if the eagle reached her 1 moment early or was 1 moment late, the kid would immediately die. Now, if I do not confuse 1 moment with another moment, would I confuse Eov with Oyev? Similarly, can you mark when the hinds do calve? The womb of this hind is narrow, which makes for a difficult delivery. When she squats to give birth, I summon her a snake that bites her at the opening of the womb. That's what we call an episiotomy, right? Which then becomes loose and she gives birth. And if the snake reached her 1 moment early or was 1 moment late, she would immediately die. Now, if I do not confuse 1 moment with another moment, would I confuse Eov with Oyev? Now, these are all examples, I grant you, of scientific beliefs that we may not be believed in in the modern world. But the point that he's making, I think, is that the Gemara is making is the same point that is of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Look at the delicate balance of nature. You can come up with your own examples of the delicate balance of nature, the symbiosis that exists, how bees are attracted to pollen, and as a result, they pollinate flowers, so that male trees and female trees are cross-pollinated so that we can continue to grow trees. I mean, how is it that bees have such an instinct? And how is it, I mean, there are so many aspects to the ecosystem that are just remarkable the more that you focus on them. Shlomo HaMelech, in so many passages in the book of Proverbs, tells us, look at the ant, learn from different types of insects and creatures, and look at the delicacy of the entire animal kingdom and the ecosystem that is around us, and you'll see a certain science, a certain accuracy, a synchronicity that is just remarkable. And if, therefore, Hashem created a system which is so well balanced, then granted that there are going to be times when the individual components of that larger system seem to be out of whack, but the larger structure tells us that there is wisdom running the system. That's the argument. That's the argument. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to be so negative today.
I don't mind, and I want you to know something. I am deeply complimented that you feel comfortable asking these questions. Because you want to know something? This is the biggest problem in our schools today, is that when you were 15 years old and you wanted to ask those questions, you didn't have an outlet to ask them. And I'm concerned that there should be places for people to ask these questions.
Well, actually, the reason I am the way I am is because my father always used to tell us, lo habayishan lo made.
Yeah, there
And
you
he
go.
would encourage us. The embarrassed person doesn't ask questions, and he always encouraged us to ask questions.
Go ahead.
A lot of people in my family find it very annoying.
And that's why Mrs. Sochachevsky comes every Tuesday morning. It's therapeutic for her. Go ahead.
But I feel like what Eob is saying and all of this, it's missing the main point. I understand that you said that these examples don't sound to us anymore because the science doesn't seem to support what it's saying, but the whole idea that Eob would say, maybe God misinterpreted my name for Oyev, why don't they just say that Hashem has everything for each person exactly? The idea that God, who knows and can do everything, would accidentally mistake someone's name for enemy doesn't make sense. Like, that's laughable. Is he saying it tongue-in-cheek?
No. So obviously there's a deeper meaning here. Eob is questioning the injustice. There is no way that a just God would treat me the way that you've treated me.
So it doesn't have anything to do with the similarity of the words.
That's the metaphor. That's simply a metaphor.
Oh,
In other words, what Eob is simply saying is, through this metaphorical question, is that, God, how could you treat me like someone that you know that I'm not? You're treating me like a bad person when I'm a good person.
I took it literally that he was saying, oh, maybe you thought I was Mr. A, I'm really Mr. B.
Yeah.
But he's not saying that.
No, he's
Right.
saying, are you really in control? Why would you do such a thing? A person in control wouldn't do such a thing.
Exactly. If you were really in control of the whole system, you would never treat a tzaddik like me in the way that you're treating me. That's
But
the
he
question.
doesn't really believe that God is not in control. It's more like, like when something happens to you, you say, really, God? Like, really?
You want to know something? The Gemara's next line, which I didn't copy for you, says that from this whole story of Eob, we learn that you cannot be critical of people who say foolish things or things that are somewhat blasphemous when in the time of pain. If a person is undergoing tremendous personal suffering, you cannot criticize them or take them to task for saying things that sound out of bounds. And the example is Eob. He was truly suffering. Look, I mean, he lost his children, he lost his wife, he lost his wealth, he lost everything. And No, you can't, like people who survived the Shoah and lost family, you can't possibly criticize them for having complaints against God because of what they experienced. But at the end of the day, the Gemara says, okay, maybe we cannot mollify Eov, but we have to speak to the larger audience for whom this story is written. Those of us who, thank God, have not had our lives broken into millions of pieces and are able to somehow cope with the day-to-day vicissitudes and disappointments and tragedies large and small. This is how we're supposed to cope with it. This is the theology that the Gemara suggests and Rabbi Yehuda Levi works off of on how we're supposed to make peace with what's going on in life. Yes?
I know that this isn't really, you can't answer this question fully, but do we believe that this really is a true story, or is this just a story, like this whole story of Job? Is it to teach us, or?
The Gemara itself ends off by saying we're not sure. There are two opinions in the Gemara itself. I encourage you to study this. The larger, it's a few pages long in Masechet Bava Batra, but the Gemara's final analysis is one opinion of one rabbi is Eov never took place. The whole story is a metaphor. And another one says, no, it definitely took place. He lived during the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. And others say he lived during the times of the Shoftim. So there's a debate when he lived, according to those who say he was a real person. But there is one opinion that says he never even existed.
But who written the book?
I don't remember who the author is. I think some people say that it was Moshe who wrote it if he lived in the times of Moshe. Yes?
For me, a great way of looking at it is from that book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And they say that the bad things are chaotic and evil, and that happens randomly in the world, but Hashem gives us the courage to deal with it. Like a tapestry, the one side is all chaotic, and the other side is beautiful and peaceful and clean.
Oh, like a tapestry. In other words, the backside of the tapestry does look chaotic, but then when you turn it over and you see what the objective was, everything forms a picture and is beautiful. The only difficulty with the book...
people say Hashem creates evil and good.
Yeah.
So that's
No,
the opposite.
I'm saying that the difficulty, I was going to say the difficulty with When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Kushner, was that he came to the conclusion after having gone through his own personal tragedy that he felt that God was not in control of certain things in the universe.
It's not an Orthodox rabbi who wrote that book.
No, we're not going to criticize someone just because they're not Orthodox. We have to look at the theology and see if it's...
From an Orthodox perspective.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. In other words, the theology itself may I believe is problematic, and just on that issue, because to suggest that God is not in control of those chaotic portions is precisely what we're trying to counteract using these arguments. God is in charge of the entire system, and if anything, if God just allowed chaos to ensue, then it would provide less, I think for a lot of people, including my way of thinking, it provides less comfort to know that someone that I loved may have died just because of chaos and they happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time instead of purpose. So, but I do like the analogy that you presented about the two sides of the tapestry.
Courage to deal with all these losses.
Well, but again, what is the source of the loss? Who created the loss? Anyway, okay, a lot to discuss about theodicy,